Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, Jerusalem psychotherapist. For this week's Parsha of Chukas, I want to suggest a short idea which relates to the concept of containment in psychodynamic theory. So we often use the phrase, I feel your pain, or I'm suffering with you, but what does it really mean? Perhaps it can relate to the idea of empathy, being able to have a cognitive and emotional level of appreciation of another person's suffering, but maybe there's something actual literal that we can understand when we say that we feel another person's pain. And this relates to the idea of containment, which is a psychodynamic concept which was developed or discussed by Wilfred Bion, where he said that what we see is when a person is overwhelmed with a certain suffering, an emotion, depression, anxiety, that they themselves cannot actually hold, and they are suffering because of their inability to contain this overwhelming emotion. Another person, often it's the primary caregiver, father, mother, or in a therapeutic sense, the therapist, they themselves become a container, or they create a holding environment to contain this overwhelming emotion of the person, of the child, or of the client. The parent or the therapist is able to contain and create this holding environment to process this overwhelming emotion. They themselves are able to, in a sense, contain it on behalf of the other person, to suffer for them. And they process it and return it back to the client or back to the child in a form that is now manageable, in a form that is now the client or the child is able to hold it themselves and is now able to cope with it by themselves and to continue to function independently. What this is this process of containment is sometimes a vital process that needs to happen for a person, that they know that there is a source of support, there is someone there, a parent or a therapist, that can contain their overwhelming emotions. And if we look at this week's Parsha, we can learn this out in a sense like as a metaphor from the idea of Tuma, that we learn in this week's Parsha. The Psukim talk about how a person can, when they come into contact with a dead body, they themselves become Tameh, or when they go into a tent, into an ohel, they themselves also become Tameh if there's a dead body within this tent. And as a metaphor, we can say that this Tuma, this dead body, is like this process. This Tuma is like a process of containment. That when people are suffering, really from severe, overwhelming anxiety or depression, sometimes they can feel that they are like a dead person. They feel dead. And they can't cope with these emotions. And what is important is that there is someone there who can contain these emotions. That when they come into contact with them, when they come into contact with another person's suffering, they are able to contain it on their behalf. And through this process, they are able to revive the person who is suffering. So obviously in this week's Parsha, when we're talking about the Tuma of a dead body, or the Tuma inside the tent, when the dead body is not going to be revived, the person cannot come alive again. But when we take this and apply it as an analogy to containment, by coming into contact with another person's suffering, another person's Tuma in a sense, if we're using this as an analogy, the person then contains themselves. They become Tameh, or they come into this holding environment, this tent, where the Tuma can be held, where the suffering can be held, and it's then returned. As we said, through this process, it's returned back to the person, and they are then revived. They can now function independently. They can function successfully and in a healthy way because of this person that acted as a container for their suffering. So this is an important message that we can take out from this week's Parsha. When we read the Pesukim about Tuma, we can try to understand and appreciate our role, how we can actually be a good, productive, and effective source of support for other people when we see they are suffering, when they see that they are overwhelmed. How can we be a container? Are we able to contain another person's suffering, to help them, to then return it back to them, that they are now able to continue on their own, continue independently, and to function well. It's a difficult role. It's sometimes not necessarily a role that everyone can take on, but it's important to acknowledge and understand how we all are surrounded by friends or family that at some point they are suffering, at some point they have difficulties. To open our eyes, to acknowledge this, to be aware of it, and try to identify perhaps whether you are the appropriate person, or whether you can find other people, help them to find the appropriate people to be a source of support, to be a container, or to create a holding environment for another person suffering. Have a great Shabbos and keep well.